Today is April 4th, 2016. My name is Tiffany Thai, and I am in the Senior Physiologist Lounge at the San Diego Convention Center during the annual meeting of the American Physiological Society. Today I have the pleasure and the honor of interviewing Dr. Larry Raymond for the Society's Living History Project. Dr. Raymond has been an APS member since 1975 and is currently affiliated with the Carolinas Medical Center in Charlotte, North Carolina. Dr. Raymond's research has focused on problems of applied physiology and hypothermia and metabolic activity at high pressure. Larry, welcome to the Living History Project, and thank you for agreeing to being interviewed for this series. If you're ready, I would like to ask you a few questions.
Yes, but first let me thank you for doing this. I think it's appropriate to have a renal physiologist interviewing me because I was a student of Dr. Robert Pitts, whose specialty was renal physiology at Cornell a long time ago.
Great. So let's begin. First, can you tell us about your family upbringing and how you became interested in science?
Well, my father's interest and work in bridge design and construction led me to study math and science. And I can still remember going on occasional field trips with Dad to see one of his bridges being built. That's how it started. But the real hook got set later on when I was a civil engineering student and had sanitary engineering professors who worked in water treatment and waste disposal methods, both of which have underpinnings in fluid flow. And so it wasn't far from there to get into physiology eventually.
Great. You received a Bachelor of Civil Engineering from Manhattan College and a Master's in Industrial Hygiene Engineering. Your path to biomedicine and physiology is very different from most people. Can you tell us about your particular journey?
Well, the main feature was at Harvard School of Public Health, where I did some graduate work, and I had professors such as Konstantin Yaglu, who was working on something called the WBGT, the wet bulb globe temperature, as an index of heat stress. And that was very interesting. The equipment we use today for that, say in the Marine Corps, to prevent heat stress and renal failure from developing in those Marines, is a lot more compact than what we had back then.
Of course.
In addition, I had a teacher, Jerry Mead, who was very interested in lung mechanics, and that was another interest that developed. And then the third person was Professor Philip Drinker, who was the co-inventor of the iron lung respirator, which saved many lives of polio patients as a result of his work. So those were all leaders who cultivated my interest.
Sounds like you were fortunate to be able to take whatever path interested you at the time. After your medical internship at Georgetown, you spent 12 years in the Navy. What were your responsibilities there to your research on the physiology of diving?
Yes, well, unlike the heat stress which Dr. Yaglu had pursued, my assignment at the Naval Medical Research Institute, called NAMRI, was to develop heated suits for divers so that they wouldn't encounter severe cold stress underwater. Not only is the water always cold as you get deeper in the ocean, but you're breathing a gas that's relatively dense, and it's coming out of tanks that are cold. So those are two respiratory and convective forces that make you cold as a diver. So my job was to work on a heated suit. We even had a small nuclear device in the backpack that the Atomic Energy Commission helped us develop. But we never got to test these. During Sealab 3, there was a tragic diving accident involving Barry Cannon, who was a wonderful diver in person. And he died basically from carbon dioxide intoxication. He had a seizure in the water and had cardiac arrest and could not be resuscitated. So that put all of that work on hold and sent me back to my internal medicine residency.
While you were associated with the Navy, you completed a pulmonary fellowship with Julius Comro and John Severnhouse at CVRI. Can you tell us about your experience there and the people with whom you worked?
Yes, well, the introduction to that, the first week we were there, Dr. Comro had gathered all the fellows together and said, now, you may be surprised to hear this, but you'll learn more from each other during these 2 years than from any of the faculty. And so it turned out that fellows like Bob Mason and Philip Hopewell were indeed not only our peers, but also our teachers. Dr. Comro had a very quiet way about him. So one Saturday afternoon, I was looking to get into the computer lab, and it was locked. But I looked up, and here comes Dr. Comro in his quiet way. I have the key. Well, he had the key to more than a locked computer lab. For example, his book, I have the copy with me today, on the physiology of respiration. My copy is well worn, but I thought I'd bring it out on this trip just for old time's sake. Dr. Severnhouse was a mentor who was a very unusual type of person. He was very hands-on. And so if we were looking for changing an apparatus or fixing something, he would get right in there with us and show us how to do it. He even took a group of us up to the White Mountains of California for some high altitude experiments in which we were our own subjects, but so was he. And so that was the kind of hands-on mentor that really helped us develop.
It sounds like, at least then, you said you were your own subject. Do you think that would be allowed today with IRBs and things like that?
I think it would be preferable. I think most IRBs would actually like that idea. It had its roots, at least to my knowledge, in Sir J.B.S. Haldane, who was an early British physiologist, and he usually participated as a subject in his own experiments.
With the thought that you know everything that could happen, right? Well, potentially.
I think it just shows diligence and
Dedication.
commitment.
Yes. In your narrative, you mentioned that you were exploring the limits of metabolic activity at pressure up to 50 atmospheres. Can you tell us about the research and the role your neighbor's agency played in that?
Well, we began the studies in the Naval Medical Research Institute that I mentioned earlier, but also extended them to what's called the Experimental Diving Unit, which was then in the Washington Navy Yard, and then down to New Orleans, where they had chambers that men could inhabit for prolonged periods at even greater depths. And so we were involved in these experiments up to a depth, equivalent depth of 1,600 feet of seawater, or about 50 times the normal atmospheric pressure. When you go that deep in the chambers, what you have to breathe is almost pure helium with just enough oxygen, probably 0.5%, to be the equivalent of normal oxygen. Now, that's a very unusual environment to inhabit, and because of the high thermal conductance of helium at that pressure, we had to have temperatures in the chambers in the low 90s, over 32 centigrade, in order to avoid shivering. Among the things that we found were that in spite of eating a very high calorie diet, 2,700 calories, and a sedentary lifestyle in the chambers, they were pretty confining, we lost between 4 and 10 kilos in weight over a 3-week interval. Of course, we were measuring our food intake and weighing ourselves very carefully each day to develop an understanding of these changes that occurred. We were able to do a fair amount of physical work in a wet pot where we were on a submerged bicycle ergometer and working away to the maximum capacity. What we didn't find was CO2 retention, which we thought we might because of the dense gas. Even helium at that pressure is 7 times as dense as air. But we found that the divers, including myself, tended to breathe like asthmatics, breathing higher and higher in the lung volume until the mechanical work of keeping at that high functional residual capacity was really quite limiting. And what we didn't know was that the neighbor of mine, Bill Colby, who was director of CIA, was funding this work in part. That's come to light recently as these findings were declassified. He was, as I say, a neighbor, and we would often see him and his wife at church. And if I said anything about, well, I'm going to go back out to Sealab, he would just nod, didn't even crack a smile, even though he was responsible for this work.
Why do you think he intentionally hid that from you?
Well, it was something I didn't need to know. And what I further didn't need to know was the mission involved in this, which was to enable divers to lock out of a special submarine at about 400 feet under the Sea of Okhotsk in Russia and put listening devices on their underwater cables that were communicating to the fleet about what they were going to do next. Now, at that time, the Russians were able to put submarines off of the coast of San Diego, for example, and we needed to know about that. So the listening device, quite ponderous in that time of technology, could be positioned on top of the cable and then downloaded every 6 weeks. 3 books have come out in the past few years that have explained all of this. And the listening device is now in a Russian museum.
So they eventually got it, right? So it seems like, you mentioned some very obvious challenges to sending humans down into the depths of the ocean. As technology progresses, do you think that there's a benefit to sending humans down that outweighs the risks?
Well, humans are often down there these days, not quite as deep as the experiments we did, but in the North Sea, for example, oil and gas production is facilitated by having divers who can do some things that robotic devices cannot do. So I think that will still be a possibility. I don't know that habitation, like we're talking about going to Mars, I don't know that habitation for prolonged periods at those great depths, like 1,000 and 1,500 feet of seawater, will ever be cost effective. But the intelligence applications might be.
And research applications, marine biology?
Underlying all of this, I think marine biology and human physiology will still, of course, be there. In fact, while we were in the chambers that I mentioned earlier, I measured scrotal temperatures in all of the divers, including me, to see whether those temperatures, given the high ambient temperatures, might be at such a level as to interfere with spermatogenesis. We know that that is a sensitive, temperature-sensitive function in all mammals, but especially in humans. And so that's another area of physiology that if prolonged habitation were ever contemplated, we'd need to know about reproductive effects both in males and females.
Absolutely. Okay, after leaving the Navy, you accepted a position at Yale and the New Haven VA Medical Center. Can you tell us about your experiences there?
Well, much of that was clinical pulmonology. Our better fellows And I can think of a couple, John Balmes, Don Mahler, and Dick Maunder. They all had wide interests, including physiology, and have gone on to have stellar academic careers at places like the CVRI in San Francisco and at Seattle and at Dartmouth in the case of Dr. Mahler, who's an exercise physiologist as well as a clinical lung doctor. But unfortunately, the veterans who came with lung cancer usually had spread of the disease by the time they came in. So we would bronchoscope them, identify the cell type, stage their disease, and then turn them over to the oncologists. But 6 months later, most of them were dead. Mm. And so I left that work to more courageous investigators than I, and thought I would go back to doing preventive medicine work, which I've done some of since.
Well, it seems like, based on your experiences, preventative medicine was definitely needed. Okay, so afterwards you returned to Exxon working on occupational medicine research with a focus on the effects on humans who worked in the petrochemical industry. What were your experiences like with Exxon?
Well, I'd been with them as an engineer right after graduate school using my WBGT equipment. And in that time, the Baton Rouge refinery had a lot of problems, health problems, with welders who would go inside vessels after they cooled down and do their welding and torch cutting. So the refinery management turned over to us a tall pipe still, as it's called, about 10 feet in diameter, and they gave that to us for our lab for one particular summer. And so we would look at the heat and the fumes and try and devise ventilation techniques to cut those down. But the welders asked questions besides the risks from heat stress, and I usually didn't know the answer. And that's why I wound up going back to Cornell Medical School, because SO Research and Engineering, my employer, had a scholarship program that fit. Well, when I came back to work for Exxon as a physician years later, we still had lots of challenges. The heat and the fume issue, I think, could be solved pretty readily, and we published that in trade journals. But things like toxic exposures, like methacrylate aerosol from some of the copiers that Exxon's applied lab, the office lab operation, produced. And these methacrylate aerosols turned out to be pretty annoying and irritating and allergenic. They caused increases in the IgE levels in the blood of people who were exposed for prolonged periods. And so we decided that that was not a technology that we wanted to pursue. We know that noise in some of our drivers of these big tanker trucks could be a problem, both with hearing loss, and also noise turned out to be a risk factor for hypertension. So this motivated us to call in PACCAR. They're a company that makes these big tractors that pull the loads on our highways. And we shared with them the fact that noise was a problem for our drivers. Well, 6 months later, didn't they come out with a different design? And in the trucking journals, their ads read, "Quiet cab for those who want to hear over 55. So we thought that was a good thing, and that would help avoid the hearing loss that our truck drivers were incurring.
I'm interested in the hypertension related to the hearing loss. if you, for example, was it directed to the actual hearing, or was it something else from the vibrations of the sound? Like if you put headphones on the truck drivers to cover their ears and protect them, would they still get the hypertension? Or?
Yes, that has not been looked at, because for them to wear conventional earmuffs or plugs would interfere with the safety of the operation.
Right, obviously.
On the other hand, if you put on with them the kind of noise barriers where through technology you can generate an equal and opposite sine wave within the cavity of the earmuff, that would null out ambient noise. Well, you still might have the problem of safety if they needed to respond to sirens, or if all of a sudden the truck is malfunctioning. They have to be able to hear that before it gets severe. So to answer your question, the experiment has not been done, but we do know that noise exposures in various settings can cause hypertension. It's well demonstrated. There are also some other effects that are less well known, like lipoprotein values can be skewed. Cardiovascular disease is higher in the noise-exposed cohort compared to an age-matched non-exposed cohort. So these are all things that the occupational environment poses as challenges to us. Another challenge is if you have a lady engineer who is pregnant and she's out in the refinery where high noise is present, she can protect herself using plugs or muffs, but the fetus would be exposed to those noise levels. So we quickly reassign persons to different jobs without noise when they declare that they're pregnant.
Wow, that's interesting. Okay, the next question is, how did your research area of expertise develop, and who were the people who influenced your career the most?
Yes, well, it began with two classmates and schoolmates from Buffalo, my hometown, Fran and Bob Clockey, each of whom has made much more important contributions to physiology and medicine than I have. But it started with them. They thought that I would do well as a physician, and so they pushed me in that direction, and I took the bait. But along the way, I had lots of other mentors besides the ones that I've mentioned. For example, at Cornell, there was a pharmacologist who was a physiologist in hiding, Frank Standard, now deceased. He went on to become chair of pharmacology at Georgetown, for example. A Navy doctor, endocrinologist named Jonas Sodi, was another inspiring person. He was very interested in mechanism, and so he encouraged me to do studies like the ones in the Navy diving arena. And then there was a Navy doctor named Bill Spohr, who was responsible for most of these undersea experiments in which I participated, and he even had me do the publications for many of them. And Dr. Spohr is retired now, but he was a great influence on me. And there are many others.
Many, many others. You seem to have made so many significant contributions to science, and I think you may have been undermining yourself a bit there with the previous comment. But in your view, what is your most significant contribution to physiology?
Well, against the backdrop of a meeting like this, I just came from a session where they're working on the exercise effects to prevent cognitive deterioration. Just to see the caliber of the physiology research today, I stand in great awe of it. So I'm a little sheepish about anything that I might have done that would stand the test of time. But I think a lot of what we did in deep diving in chambers will probably not be reinvestigated anytime soon. What has been revisited has generally been confirmed, and so I think that it it is a solid set of results thanks to a huge team for which I'm the cheerleader. That work, if it helps with our national defense and that of our allies, may well be worth the effort.
Of course. This next question is quite interesting. Tell us about the first APS meeting you went to and how it's different from the meeting we're at now.
Well, it's staggering, the difference, because that meeting, I think the first one I attended was in 1967 at Howard University. And to my surprise, as well as his, didn't I encounter Dr. Robert Pitts as he was strolling the campus. And he was very surprised to see one of his ex-students. But they had accepted an abstract I put in on some of the metabolic effects of helium under pressure. And so I got to go. So that was such a different meeting because its size would be just 1/20th of today's meeting here. Of course, we're meeting with other societies, such as the anatomists and the nutritionists and the biochemists, but that made this meeting in San Diego such a huge, dazzling comparison.
It's much larger. What role has the APS and other societies played in your career?
I look on the APS as a great club because it does foster investigation across all disciplines. It has many journals these days. My favorite still is the Journal of Applied Physiology.
Why is that?
Because they let me put my stuff there. But also I do tend to be more interested in the intact human or the human with disease processes. But as physiologists or physiology wannabes, we look at mechanism, and I think that's important because if we're going to understand how to fix things when they get broken in human and in other mammals, then we need to understand what is the basic mechanism in normal function.
Yes. I've heard rumors actually at this meeting that physiology as a science is dying out. So you would argue that it definitely should be maintained.
I don't see how the practice of medicine could survive without physiology. It's like saying you could be a doctor without knowing any anatomy or histology. I just think that's extremely wrong-headed, and for those who wouldn't fund these investigations, I think it would be very short-sighted indeed.
Yes. And lastly, what advice would you give to young students starting out in science today? This is their first meeting. What should they do?
Yes. Well, I hope that they will seek mentors for their further development. They may be undergrads now and not doing much research themselves, but learning the tools. But when it comes time to try and find the right mentor, that they will see if they can find one who will be invested in their future. And that's not necessarily the most famous,
Absolutely.
although I think it was with Comro and Severinghaus. But the investigator who will take the time to look at her future, his future, as would-be investigators. I'm always recalling the old saying, we see more clearly, for we stand on the shoulders of giants.
Great advice. That ends our interview, and I would like to thank you very much for meeting with me today. It's been such a pleasure getting to know you.
Thank you for your time, and I hope you'll continue your own award-winning investigations.
Thanks.